Congratulations on getting a hold of the look hacking system. You're going to learn how to recreate any look of any film. If you're like myself and many other filmmakers out there, you may spend a lot of time watching movies and being amazed by their looks. You sometimes, like me, might wonder how a filmmaker achieves a particular look and may even want to try out a similar look on your own project. Well, this is what this training is all about. We're going to go through the process of breaking down 2 Hollywood films and then apply those looks to clips of our own. This may seem like a daunting task, but we're going to follow a process that will make this a lot easier. We're going to ask ourselves a number of questions about the look with the goal of translating that look into language. Then from there, we can then turn that language into actionable corrections with the help of our video scopes so we can apply the same look to our image. Now, one thing to keep in mind is you want to make sure that your footage has a similar art direction to the reference image or the look that you're going for. Though you can make some pretty significant changes to the look with Lumetri in Adobe Premiere, there are some limitations to how much we can change a scene. Okay, so here are the things we need to ask ourselves when evaluating a look. First, we'll ask some very general questions that revolve around the hue, saturation, and luma of the reference still. We'll follow a workflow that incorporates all of those, but in a different order. Like with the typical color grading workflow that we use during color correction, we'll first look at the luma, then hue, then saturation. So following that order, let's first take a look at the luma-related questions we should ask ourselves. What is the brightness and contrast like in the image? Is it a bright scene or a dark scene? Would you consider the contrast to be high key or low key? You'll want to get a good screen grab from the film you're trying to emulate so that we can bring that into Resolve and analyze it using the video scopes. Once we do that, we can ask more specific questions like, where's the trace gathered in the waveform? Is there detail in the shadows? And if so, how much? Is there detail in the brightest highlights? And if so, how much? Then we can move on to analyzing the color in the image. What colors do you see? Does the image have a single dominant color? Does the scene follow a particular color scheme? What color are the highlights? What color are the shadows and undertones? And as the final step in the workflow, let's ask the questions, what are the saturation levels like? Is there a certain object or color that's emphasized or more saturated than the others? Armed with this information, we can then recreate any look that we like, again, assuming that the art direction and the type of shot is similar to the source material that we're trying to emulate. In this tutorial, we're going to recreate looks for Mad Max, Fury Road, and the film Her. The first thing we'll need is a good high-resolution reference still. If you have a Blu-ray available, that will give you the best quality, but in most cases, pulling from streaming sites will give you a good result as well. However, because of recently implemented copy protections, you may end up with a black frame for a screenshot if you're trying to pull still from a streaming site like Netflix. The success with this varies depending upon your browser and location. Also, one thing you want to be aware of when pulling stills from the internet, stills you find on Google are often heavily compressed and oversaturated. This can happen because the actual grading in the film is actually different from the grading done for the movie trailer. Now, to get those screen grabs, if you're on a Mac, you can grab a still by hitting Command-Shift-3 as the video plays back. The still will then appear on your desktop. If you're on Windows, you can grab a still by hitting the Print Screen button. The still will then be saved in the Screenshots folder, which is located inside of the Pictures folder. In our case, I've already gone ahead and grabbed all the stills we need. For our first example, we're going to use 2 different reference stills from Mad Max Fury Road. One of them is a close-up shot of Max's face, and the other is a wide shot that shows the sky. Let's start by asking ourselves the questions I mentioned earlier so that we can put this look into language. Speaking generally, with regard to brightness and contrast, these are bright, daytime images with high contrast. Using the video scopes to assist us, you can see that the waveform confirms the high contrast based on the expanded trace on both images. Now we should look for highlight and shadow detail. Except for the brightest highlights on the car, the highlights maintain detail. If you look at the highlights on Max's forehead, you can see this more clearly. The shadows, while not crushed on the waveform, are pretty deep and don't maintain much detail. So now that we've evaluated the reference stills for contrast, let's match it the best we can using the video scopes as a guide. We'll start out by making sure the Luma waveform is visible, and we'll use the image of Max as our reference for now. To best match these images, we'll need to have both of them visible on our screen at the same time. The only real good way to do this in Premiere is to composite one shot on top of the other, resize, and reposition them. Now, the problem with using the reference monitor option, though you can see both images at the same time, you won't be able to compare the traces side by side in the video scopes. So I'll drag the Fury Road Max still on top of the clip that we're trying to apply the Mad Max look to. And in the effects controls, let's resize the shot to 50% and drag the shot of Max to the right until it touches the edge of the frame. Now click on the video clip on the bottom, change the scale to 50%, and then drag the X position to the left until the edges of the shots line up. This image was shot with a log gamma profile, so we'll have quite a bit of flexibility as we make the changes. However, it can be difficult to evaluate contrast with such low saturation. So in the basic correction panel, let's drag the saturation slider all the way to the right. Now let's move over to the curves panel, and then using the Luma curve, let's drag the bottom point to the right until the shadows line up with the reference still. Then let's drag the top point to the left. And from here, we'll create an S-curve to increase the exposure of the overtones and darken the undertones. I'll make a point here and drag up and to the left. And then make another point here and drag down and to the right slightly, making an S-curve. The contrast now matches pretty closely. We can always make adjustments later if we need to. Okay, now let's move on to color. The first question we should ask is, what colors do we see? In both reference stills, we can see a heavy amount of orange as well as cyan in the sky. The clouds and smoke also appear slightly pink. If you look at the vector scope, we can see that this film follows a complementary color scheme, which means almost all the colors in the scheme sit directly across from each other on the color wheel. The shadows and undertones have a very slight teal quality to them, while the highlights are neutral in color. Looking at the combined trace on the vector scope for the two images, you can also see that there are high levels of saturation with the trace extending far out from the center. So let's apply this color scheme to our image. Let's open the color wheels panel, and using the gain control, if we drag on the color wheel, we can see our image change in the vector scope. If we drag up and to the left, we can add warmth until the traces generally align like so. The colors are looking pretty close, but we can finesse them a bit using the curves. Now what I'd like to do is to start by creating an S-curve in the red channel, and to do that, we'll need to make points here and here to protect the midtones. Then another point here and drag up. You can see this helps to narrow the trace in the vector scope, making it more similar to the reference still. Now that fixed the overall hue of the image, but if we look at the quarter tones on Max's gun, you can see that they have a teal quality to them, while ours are looking pretty red. So using the same curve, I can click here and drag down to create warm-cool contrast. Then we'll just need to clean up the deepest shadows by dragging the bottom point to the right. I'm also seeing a little extra green in the quarter tones, so we'll make a point here and here, again to protect the highlights, and another point here, and drag down just slightly. Now let's work on matching the sky. For this, we'll use the other reference still. So let's drag that to the top, and then to match the properties of the other reference still, we'll click on the shot of Max and hit the keyboard shortcut Command or Control-C to copy it. Then click on the top still, go to Edit, then Paste Attributes. Click on Motion, and then Paste. You can see that the trace in the vector scope representing the sky is extended towards cyan, so we'll need to reproduce that hue and saturation. To do this, we'll want to go back to the original image and sample the sky. So let's add another instance of Lumetri color. And to get back to the original image, we'll need this effect to be on top in the filter stack, so we can drag it like so. Now something to keep in mind is that the Lumetri color controls always show the controls for the bottom effect. So we'll need to make our adjustment in the Effect Controls panel itself. And the other thing to remember is when sampling part of an image using the HSL secondary panel, it samples whatever the current state of your image is. So in other words, if we try to grab the sky right now, it will sample the yellow that we applied in our color correction. So let's turn off the bottom Lumetri color effect. Then open the HSL secondary panel for the top instance and click the Set Color Eyedropper. Then I'll click on the sky and turn on the Show Mask feature. This did a good job, but adding a little denoise and blur will smooth out the key. Now we can turn off the Show Mask feature and turn the bottom instance of Lumetri back on. Okay, now in the correction section, we'll drag the color wheel towards cyan until the two traces align in the vector scope. To make the sky a little more natural and to reduce the effects our correction had on the rest of the image, which you can see if I turn the correction off and then back on, let's make a few more adjustments. In the Effect Controls panel, let's select the rectangular mask next to the top instance of Lumetri color, and then position it like this over the sky. We want to add some softness and position the shape so that there's a natural fall off as you get closer to the ground. So I'll drag the softness control and then reposition the shape. That's looking pretty good. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the smoke in the reference still has a slightly pink quality to it, so we can apply this to the clouds to match. We'll repeat a similar process to what we did for the sky. We'll want to add another instance of Lumetri color. Then using the HSL secondary panel, let's select the sky with the Set Color Eyedropper. Then we'll refine the key to add a little bit more and add some denoise and blur. Then we can open the three-way color corrector and add some pink in the highlights and reduce their exposure as well. Now that did what we wanted, but affected too much of the image. Let's again further qualify this correction using a shape. In the Effect Controls, I'll again select a rectangular mask and size and position it around the clouds, making sure to add some softness. Lastly, I'd like to neutralize the color in the brightest highlights. Let's use the still of Max as a reference. So I'll turn off video track 3. Now let's add one more instance of Lumetri color, but this time we can leave it on the bottom. Then using the Lumetri color controls in the HSL secondary panel, we can use the Set Color Eyedropper to select the brightest parts of the man's fingers. We can turn off the hue and saturation selections, and then refine the luma selection until we get something like this. As always, a little denoise and blur can really help hide the key. Now all we need to do is to reduce the saturation. As a final touch, I think the entire image is a little too saturated, so we can go up to the basic correction panel and back off the saturation just a touch. It's looking pretty convincing. So again, to match this look, we followed the following steps. Number 1, we grabbed a high resolution still from the source material that we wanted to emulate. Number 2, define the look using the color language we talked about. And number 3, we then use the split screen view and the video scopes to help us achieve our match. So let's try this one more time with a completely different look. In this case, we're going to pick a still from the movie Her. And by the way, the example image that we're using to match to Her is from filmsupply.com. The artist is Cypher, and it's from the Cosmic Event Collection. Just like before, we'll first need to put this look into language. In general, this is conveying an overcast afternoon and has moderately low contrast with elevated shadows and muted highlights. Let's take a look at just the skin tones to get help with our matching. You can see that they sit between zones 3 and 6. Okay, so now let's first adjust for contrast and then we'll address color later. Let's repeat the process from before to get a side-by-side view. I'll take a reference shot from the film Her and put it on top of the clip from Film Supply. And in the effects controls, let's resize the shot to 50% and drag the X position to the right until the clip reaches the edge of the frame. Now click on the clip on the bottom and change the scale to 65%. We can make it a bit bigger since the aspect ratio of the two clips are different. We'll then drag the X position until the shot is positioned like so. Now in Lumetri color, I'll open the curves panel, then I'll drag the top point to the left to match the highlights. Then I'll make a point here and drag up to match the brightest parts of the skin. You can see these parts represented here in the trace. Then make a point here and drag down to match the skin undertones. Then adjust the bottom point down and to the right to restore the shadows to the previous level. The sky is obviously brighter than the reference shot, but we can fix that in the next step. So now let's look at color. I've increased the scale of the trace in the vector scope to make it easier to see since both images have relatively low saturation. This shot has an analogous color scheme, which means it's only using colors that are directly next to each other on the color wheel. The image is only made up of yellow, orange, and red. So that we don't get distracted by the red-orange shirt, I've gone ahead and desaturated it so we can just see the color for the rest of the image. Now if we move to our shot of the man on the roof, we can see that this shot incorporates more of a complementary color scheme with mostly orange and blue cyan. We can use the still I've provided with the desaturated shirt to make our color matching easier. Let's drag the version with the desaturated shirt to the top layer, copy the attributes from the previous version using the keyboard shortcut Command or Control-C. Then going back to the clip with the desaturated shirt, we'll use the keyboard shortcut Command-Option-V to paste the motion attributes. For this step, having the RGB parade available to us will be our best bet. So let's right-click on the scopes to switch to the parade scope. What we'll be looking to do with the curves is match the highlights and the shadows for all three color channels. So starting with the blue channel, we can see that our clip has way too much blue in the highlights compared to the reference still. So let's drag the top point down, subtracting blue, adding yellow until they match. Then repeat the process for green and red. Now we just need to adjust the bottom point slightly so that the shadows match for all three channels. Give me just a moment while I do this. That's already looking much better, and it fixed the exposure problem that we created with the Luma curve. Now to check on how we did, I'd like to bring up the vector scope. As I turn the visibility for the bottom clip on and off, we can see that it's a little more saturated than in the reference clip. So going back to the basic correction panel, let's reduce the saturation slightly. This is definitely an improvement, but the sky still looks like it has too much color compared to the still from the film. So in the HSL secondaries panel, let's click on the eyedropper and drag through the sky. We'll need to turn on the show mask feature to see what we selected. Now using the plus eyedropper, let's drag through more of the sky. There, that's much better. We'll add a little denoise and blur to reduce any chatter in the key. While leaving the show mask feature on, let's click on the her clip with the desaturated shirt and go to the effect controls. Then using the pen next to opacity, let's draw a rough shape that isolates only the sky. Once you've closed your shape, we'll also need to turn off the clip on video track 2. Then click on the bottom clip. We can now see the significant difference in the hue and saturation in the skies. So using the temperature, tint, and saturation controls, we can make adjustments until the skies align in the vector scope. There, that looks much better. We can turn off the show mask feature and go back to the top clip and turn off the opacity effect. I think our shot is looking pretty good, but the man in our shot could definitely use an exposure boost in his skin tones. So to do this, let's add another instance of Lumetri Color. And in the HSL secondaries panel, let's click on the eyedropper and drag through his skin. Then I'll refine the key using the hue, saturation, and luma parameters. Now, don't worry that we're grabbing a little bit of information outside of the skin tones. We'll fix this in a later step. Okay, so after adding some denoise and blur, we can open the three-way color corrector and now increase the exposure of the midtones. That not only fixed our exposure, but it reduced the perception that the skin tones were oversaturated. Now if we just add a little warmth to the mids, our skin tones will be all set. So now let's just further qualify this effect by going into the Effect Controls panel, clicking on the circle next to the new Lumetri Color effect, and positioning it over our talent's face. Then let's track the shot forward since there's a little bit of motion in the shot. Very nice. The match is looking excellent. So I hope that this video has given you the confidence you need to go out and hack any look using the Lumetri color tools inside of Adobe Premiere Pro. I suggest that you try this technique with the looks from your own favorite films. Thanks for watching and happy hacking.